All right, welcome back, everyone. I would like to do a quick walkthrough of section 17.2 on hormones. So we know that we just talked about endocrine glands releasing hormones directly into the bloodstream. And when you release that hormone into the bloodstream, it has a chance to interact with every type of cell that it comes into contact with. However, hormones will only affect the activity of its target cells, which are the cells that have receptors for that particular hormone. And so we're going to walk through different types of hormones, how they interact with their target cells, and how hormones can affect other hormones. And so let's just get into it. Right off the bat, here is a list of the major hormones in the body and their effects. And I just highlighted a few that I thought were interesting or that we'd heard about before. The first one is growth hormone, which is a protein hormone, which we know promotes growth of the body tissues. We know that some athletes have used HGH or human growth hormone as a performance enhancing substance. And here's that antidiuretic hormone, which will stimulate water reabsorption by the kidneys, right? Here is oxytocin, which we said has a number of effects. One of them is to stimulate uterine contractions during childbirth. Melatonin, which helps regulate sleep cycles. Insulin and glucagon, I didn't highlight there, but insulin and glucagon, they have opposite effects, which insulin reduces blood glucose levels, glucagon increases it. Then we have testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. Testosterone is the male sex hormone, whereas estrogen and progesterone are the female sex hormones. So those are just a few of the major body hormones and just some of them that I wanted to go over. When we talk about types of hormones, there's two major types. There are the hormones that are derived from amino acids, which include the amines, the peptides, and the proteins. And all pretty similar, except just in a few different distinct ways we'll talk about. And then the second group are the lipid hormones, which are the steroids. And based on the chemical groups that they're made of, we know that they will then have different chemical effects. And we'll get a little bit into that in this chapter. So an amine hormone is an amino acid with modified groups like norepinephrine's carboxyl group being replaced with a benzene ring. So if you remember what a amino acid looks like, it had both a carboxyl group and an amino group. And here we'll see that the carboxyl group gets replaced and most often the amino group remains. Then we talk about peptide hormones, which are going to be short chains of linked amino acids. We remember that two amino acids are held together by peptide bonds. And so that could remind you that peptide hormones are just small chains of amino acids. And then protein hormones are just longer chains of amino acids. And so if you remember when we talked about amino acids linking together by peptide bonds to form proteins, this sort of should just already be familiar to you. And then the last are those steroid hormones. Remember when I talked about steroid hormones, when I talked about steroids, like cholesterol, I said that their structure looks like an S for a steroid, and so here they are again. These are testosterone and progesterone. Once again, the male secondary sex characteristics hormone, and the female progesterone and estrogen. So just like I said, but once more I'll show you, is that amine hormones are modifications of amino acids. Literally, quite literally, just amino acids that are modified, and they become hormones at that point. What we see is that typically it's the COOH or the carboxyl group being removed, while the NH3 amine group remains. The amine hormones are going to be synthesized from two amino acids, either tryptophan or tyrosine. An example of one that's derived from tryptophan is melatonin, and tyrosine derivatives include the thyroid hormones, which are help regulate your metabolism. And so not too much more to go into here, but just to realize that amine hormones are a singular amino acid. Then we move up to peptide and proteins, which are short chains of amino acids, peptide, and longer chains of amino acids when we talk about proteins. So I think that's really all I want to get into here. But remember that both types are synthesized just like any other body proteins. When you have DNA transcribed to mRNA, remember, same language is transcribed, and then you translate RNA into an amino acid protein, but changing the language translate. So if you remember that, that'll help you. Uh, One example is antidiuretic hormone is a peptide hormone. And so let's just keep moving up to the steroid hormones. The steroid hormones are going to be the hormones derived from lipids. The big one is that is used is the lipid cholesterol. Um, like I just said, the reproductive hormones, testosterone and estrogen, which are produced by the gonads, which are the testes and ovaries. Um, those are the main steroid hormones that we'll talk about. We also have some in the adrenal glands, and steroid hormones, which we probably remember, are steroids are not going to be soluble in water. They are hydrophobic. What that does mean, however, is that they are lipid soluble, and what we'll see in just a second. It means that they can pass through the phospholipid bilayer much easier than a hydrophilic um, hormone can. But what I want to point out is that because blood is water-based and these guys are hydrophobic, they have to travel to their target cell bound to what is called a transport protein. And so basically it's a protein that is bound to the steroid hormone. And because of that, that extends their half-life. And what a half-life is basically the amount of time that it takes for half of the amount of that substance to be degraded. And so what you'll see is that when these steroid hormones are bound to their proteins, their transport proteins, they go from what is normally about a minute half-life time to about 60 to 90 minutes of half-life time. And so really that's interesting because it can cause them to elicit reactions for a much longer amount of time. Um, let's talk about pathways of hormone action. The message that a hormone sends is received by its receptor cells, right? Its target cells. A protein, which the receptors are a protein which are either going to be located on the inside of the cell or attached to or within the cell membrane. Um, Once the hormone binds to the receptor, it'll initiate a cascading series of events that causes cell mechanisms to start and create some sort of response. Okay, there's tons of different responses that will occur, and we'll get into those later when we talk about the different glands and the hormones they produced. But remember that these receptors are only going to recognize molecules that have the exact specific shape or side groups, and once again, they only respond to those specific hormones. So tons of hormones could pass by those receptors. They're not going to be able to bind because they are very specific. So it doesn't matter if hormone A passes by hormone B's receptor, it's not going to elicit a response. But just to make it more confusing, the same type of receptor might be located on cells in different body tissues and trigger somewhat different responses. And so thus the response triggered by a hormone depends not only on the hormone, but also on the target cell. And so that can get kind of confusing, and I'll make sure that I explain it as well as I can. And also, there's going to be a lot of information in these chapters that I'm not going to expect you to know, like in this next section right here. So when we talk about pathways that involve intracellular hormone receptors, those are going to be receptors that are, of course, inside of the cell. And in order to get inside of the cell, you have to pass through the cellular membrane. If you remember, we talked about the cellular membrane being hydrophobic on some portions and hydrophilic on other portions, and it being selectively permeable, meaning that some things are able to readily pass right through. Other things have to go through what we call those protein channels to get inside. So if you are a hormone that has to get to inside of the cell, you must be able to cross the cell membrane. And the only ones that are able to do that are the steroid hormones because they are lipid soluble. Okay? And the example that we'll talk about are the thyroid hormones, as well as the steroid hormones, but also the thyroid hormones contain these benzene rings. Whenever you see benzene rings, those are also going to be lipid soluble because they're hydrophobic. But anyway, so I'll take you through this because look at all this information here. Not going to ask you to remember all of this stuff. We're going to skip a good portion of it, but just to take a look. Here's the lipid soluble hormone coming through the blood capillaries, the blood. It is able to diffuse out of the capillary into through the plasma membrane. It'll bind to the receptor, forming that receptor hormone complex. Just means it bound together. Then it will enter the nucleus and trigger some sort of gene transcription. And when you transcribe a gene, transcribe DNA, you make an mRNA, which then exits the nucleus and is translated into a protein. And so that's how a lipid-soluble hormone basically binds its receptor and elicits some sort of response here. Now, when we talk about pathways that involve cell membrane hormone receptors, or basically having receptors on the outside of the cell, those are going to be the hydrophilic or water-soluble hormones that are not going to be able to diffuse through the lipid bilayer because the inside of the lipid bilayer is extremely hydrophobic. Those are going to be all of the amino acid derived hormones besides those thyroid hormones because they have the benzene ring like we just talked about. But all of those are going to have to bind to the receptors on the cell's surface. And so what they say is that therefore they don't directly affect the transcription of a target gene like we saw up here, but instead they have to initiate this cascading effect that is carried out by what is called a second messenger. And in this case, the hormone is called the first messenger, then a second messenger. So the second messenger that's used by most hormones is this molecule called cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP, or CAMP. So I'm not going to ask you to remember most of this, but let's walk through it. So in the bloodstream, here comes our water-soluble hormone. It attaches to its cell membrane receptor, and this binding activates what is called a G protein. The G protein activates adenyl cyclase. Adenyl cyclase catalyzes the conversion of ATP to CAMP. That's the secondary messenger. Then CAMP, the secondary messenger, activates some protein kinases, and then protein kinases phosphorylate proteins in the cytoplasm, which activates those proteins and allows them to do whatever the original hormone wanted this cell to do. And so it's this big, long list of things because this hormone can't get into the cell, and so it's got to initiate this cascading effect that eventually gets the cell to do what it wants. Okay, so I just sort of breezed through that. You can read this a little bit more and make sure you understand. Basically, what I want you to take away is that if a hormone is not lipid soluble and can't get into the cell, it has to initiate this cascading effect where it ends up making a secondary messenger have to carry its message to make the cell do what it wants it to do. Okay, so I'm going to skip a bunch of this and then go into some factors that will affect how a target cell will respond. So there are several factors. So you might have the presence of a significant level of a hormone circulating in the bloodstream, and that can cause its target cells to decrease their number of receptors for that hormone. So if you've got a bunch of hormone running around in the body, your cell might not want to be super highly reactive to it. And so that process is called downregulation, and downregulation allows cells to become less reactive when you've got an excessive number of that hormone, or an excessive amount of that hormone. But on the other side, if you have a small amount of hormone, it's chronically reduced, target cells will do what is called upregulation, and it'll increase their receptors. Basically, give the cell the most reactivity to that hormone. So if it's got if your body is producing very little of a hormone, cells will increase their number of receptors. That's called upregulation, so that it gives it the most opportunity to interact with that hormone, and that allows them to be more sensitive to them. And then two or more hormones can also interact and make various different responses. So the first effect is called the permissive effect, and that's in which the presence of one hormone will enable another hormone to react. So for example, thyroid hormones will have these permissive relationships with reproductive hormones. if you have a deficiency of iodine in your diet, a component of thyroid hormones, it can therefore affect reproductive system development and functioning. So you need one in order for the other to act. Then there's the synergistic effect, and those will be in which two hormones with similar effects produce an amplified response. In some cases, you might need both to create even an adequate response. And the example here is two reproductive hormones, follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland and estrogen from the ovaries, are required for the maturation of the female egg cell. And so if you only had one and not the other, there's going to be some problems in that process. And then the opposite of that is the antagonistic effect, in which two hormones have opposing effects. The example that we talked about before are the pancreatic hormones, insulin and glucagon, where insulin will decrease blood glucose levels, glucagon will increase it. And so they have opposite effects there. Moving on, regulation of hormone secretion. Basically, this is talking about feedback loops, and we'll go over it really, really briefly here. But there's two types. There's positive feedback loops, which are much rarer. If you remember way back in the beginning of Anatomy and Physiology 1, we talked about the one main positive feedback loop is that release of oxytocin during childbirth will continue to upregulate, or basically continue to increase in that positive feedback loop, and it'll signal those uterine muscles to contract. And this is one of the rare instances of a positive feedback loop, where the more common method is a negative feedback loop, where if you get enough of this hormone secreted, it will tell it basically to stop. And so it's just a negative feedback. It allows blood levels of it to be regulated within a narrow range. Once you get enough of it, it will signal to stop the production of it. And so once again, negative feedback loops are much more common than positive feedback loops, because basically what you never want is for something to be produced in a much higher basically much more than you need, because it takes energy to produce these things, and also the responses that they create could be detrimental if too much of it is happening. Okay, and the last section here is the role of endocrine gland stimuli. And there's two types we'll talk about. Humoral stimuli, which are changes in blood levels of non-hormone chemicals like nutrients or ions, which will cause the release of or the inhibition of a hormone, and that just maintains homeostasis. So the example here is osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus detect changes in blood osmolarity, basically the concentration of solutes in the plasma. If the blood osmolarity is too high, meaning that the blood is just not dilute enough, osmoreceptors will signal the hypothalamus to release that antidiuretic hormone. And if basically the regulation of that water in the kidneys will help to either increase the dilution of the blood or decrease it. And so the second one I want to talk about is an endocrine gland might also secrete a hormone response if there's a presence of another hormone produced by a different endocrine gland. That often involves the hypothalamus, which produces releasing and inhibiting hormones that control the secretion of a variety of the pituitary hormones. In addition to those, hormones can also be released in response to neural stimuli. Remember, that's how your fight or flight responses work. Your neural stimulus will be very, very quick and act upon your endocrine glands to release the hormones needed there. The example they give is when you perceive danger, your sympathetic neurons will signal your adrenal glands to secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine, basically noradrenaline and adrenaline. And those will dilate your blood vessels, increase your heart rate and your breathing rate, and suppress your digestive and immune systems. And those need to happen very, very quickly when your fight or flight responses kick in. Okay, so that is a much longer lecture than I like to do normally for these videos, but thanks for sticking around. We'll be back with the rest of this section very soon.